Northern France, August 1944. A German military police unit stationed near Caen relied on their most trusted security asset, 12 trained German shepherds that patrolled the perimeter of their command post every night. These dogs were legendary among local resistance fighters. Impossible to evade, ruthlessly efficient at detecting intruders, responsible for the capture of at least 8 Allied agents attempting to infiltrate the area. The resistance had tried everything. Silent approaches, the dogs heard them. Downwind approaches, the dogs smelled them anyway. Even attempts to poison meat left as bait failed. The dogs were trained to refuse food from anyone except their handlers. The German command post seemed impenetrable as long as those dogs remained effective. Then, on the night of August 12th, something changed. An SOE commando team approaching the perimeter for a reconnaissance mission expected the usual challenge. Dogs barking, German soldiers alerted, mission aborted. Instead, they encountered something unprecedented. The dogs were there, patrolling as usual. But as the commandos moved through the darkness, the dogs began behaving strangely. They whined, paced nervously, scratched at their noses with their paws. One dog vomited. Another lay down, refusing to continue patrol. The lead dog, a massive shepherd named Thor that handlers considered unshakable, suddenly turned and fled back toward the kennels, pulling his handler off balance. Within minutes, all 12 dogs had abandoned their posts. Some refused to leave the kennels. Others whined and paced, clearly distressed but unable to perform their duties. The German handlers were baffled. Their dogs showed no signs of illness or injury, just complete inability to function as guard animals. The commandos completed their reconnaissance without incident, gathering intelligence that contributed to Allied operations the following week. The German dogs remained useless for 3 days before gradually recovering their abilities, but never fully returned to their previous effectiveness. Something had broken their confidence, destroyed their trust in their own senses. What the Germans never discovered was that hours before the commandos arrived, an SOE operative had detonated 3 small devices upwind of the German position. The devices released a chemical compound so pungent, so overwhelming to canine senses, that it temporarily destroyed the dog's ability to smell anything else. Their most refined sense, the foundation of their training and effectiveness, was rendered useless by British chemical warfare. The compound was based on allicin, the sulfur compound that gives garlic its distinctive smell. But this was garlic concentrated and weaponized to levels that would overwhelm any canine nose within 100 meters. The British called them S-bombs officially, but everyone who knew about them used their nickname, garlic bombs. This is the story of the weapon that turned man's best friend against his master, and how British chemists found a way to defeat guard dogs without harming them. Let's go back to 1942. The Special Operations Executive faced a persistent problem across occupied Europe. German military installations, ammunition depots, headquarters, and sensitive facilities were protected not just by guards and fences, but by trained guard dogs. These animals represented a security layer that human soldiers couldn't match. Dogs possess sensory capabilities far beyond human capacity. A trained German shepherd could detect human scent from hundreds of meters away, hear footsteps that human guards missed entirely, and identify intruders in complete darkness using only their nose and ears. They didn't sleep on duty, couldn't be bribed, wouldn't abandon their posts out of fear or cowardice. In many ways, dogs were the perfect security asset. For resistance fighters and SOE agents, guard dogs represented nearly insurmountable obstacles. You could avoid human guards by studying their patrol patterns, identifying gaps in coverage, timing your infiltration perfectly. But dogs didn't have predictable patterns. They reacted to threats as threats appeared. You couldn't sneak past a nose that could smell you from 100 meters upwind. Traditional countermeasures were limited and unsatisfactory. Shooting dogs alerted the entire installation, defeating the purpose of covert infiltration. Poisoning was difficult because trained military dogs were taught to refuse food from strangers. Distracting them with female dogs in heat only worked if you could get a female dog close enough, which created its own infiltration problems. What the SOE needed was a way to neutralize guard dogs temporarily, without killing them, without alerting handlers, and without requiring close proximity to the animals. The solution needed was to work from a distance, affect all dogs in an area simultaneously, and wear off relatively quickly so the sabotage or reconnaissance mission could be completed before the dogs recovered. Station 9, working with chemists and veterinary specialists, approached the problem from a biological perspective. What if you could overload a dog's sense of smell, not damage it permanently, but overwhelm it so completely that the dog couldn't smell anything else? If a dog's nose was flooded with an overpowering scent, it would be functionally blind to other smells, including the scent of infiltrating humans. The chemical they developed was based on synthetic allicin, the sulfur compound produced when garlic is crushed. In normal concentrations, allicin produces the familiar garlic smell that humans find moderately unpleasant. But dogs, with their sense of smell estimated to be 10,000 to 100,000 times more sensitive than humans, would find concentrated allicin absolutely overwhelming. The weaponized version concentrated allicin to levels far beyond anything found in nature. A single gram of the compound, when released into the air, could produce an olfactory cloud that would completely saturate every dog nose within a 100-meter radius. The dogs wouldn't be injured, the compound was non-toxic, but they'd be temporarily useless as guard animals. Creating an effective anti-dog chemical weapon required understanding both chemistry and canine biology in detail. Station 9's chemists collaborated with veterinary researchers and university scientists to develop a compound that would achieve the desired effect without causing permanent harm to the animals. Allicin became the foundation because of its unique properties. As a volatile sulfur compound, it disperses readily in air, creating a persistent smell that lingers for hours. It's non-toxic to mammals in the concentrations needed for olfactory saturation, meaning it wouldn't kill or permanently injure dogs or humans exposed to it. And critically, it produces an odor that dogs find extremely offensive at concentrations that humans merely find unpleasant. The weaponized formulation intensified natural allicin concentrations by factors of hundreds or thousands. Station 9 chemists developed synthesis methods that could produce pure allicin in quantities far exceeding what natural garlic crushing would yield. This thick, oily liquid that, when released, would vaporize and create an olfactory cloud of unprecedented pungency. To this base, chemists added other sulfur compounds, thiols, sulfides, and mercaptans that enhanced and prolonged the effect. These compounds are responsible for the smell of skunks, rotten eggs, and decomposing organic matter, smells that dogs instinctively find disturbing and that would further overwhelm their olfactory systems. The complete formulation, designated Compound S44 in official documents, but universally called Dog Days or simply Garlic Bomb by operatives, produced a smell that human beings described as nauseating but tolerable. Dogs exposed to it experienced something entirely different. Their vastly more sensitive noses were bombarded with olfactory information at levels that essentially created sensory overload. Veterinary consultants explained the effect to Station 9 engineers. Imagine if someone turned your visual brightness up by a factor of 10,000 while simultaneously making everything glow intensely. You wouldn't be blind, but you couldn't see useful detail because your visual system would be saturated. That's what weaponized garlic did to dogs' noses. It didn't damage them, but it made them temporarily useless. The delivery mechanism evolved through several iterations. Early versions used simple glass bottles that operatives would break upwind of target areas, releasing the compound to drift toward guard dog positions. This worked, but required operatives to get relatively close to targets before deployment, not ideal for maintaining standoff distance. Station 9 developed a more sophisticated delivery system, small explosive devices that would rupture containers of the compound, vaporizing it instantly and creating a much larger dispersal pattern. These S-bombs looked like standard hand grenades, but instead of shrapnel, they contained pressurized containers of compound S-44 surrounded by a small bursting charge. The explosive charge was carefully calculated, just powerful enough to rupture the container and disperse the compound, not so powerful that it would alert enemy forces. The detonation produced a muffled pop rather than a loud bang, barely audible beyond 50 meters. The compound then vaporized and spread, carried by wind, creating an invisible barrier that dogs couldn't penetrate. Timing was critical. The compound took approximately 5 to 10 minutes to reach full effectiveness after dispersal, as the vapor cloud expanded and saturated the area. Operatives had to deploy S-bombs early enough that the dogs would be affected before infiltration began, but not so early that handlers might notice their dog's distress and investigate before the operation commenced. Weather conditions dramatically affected effectiveness. Wind was both ally and enemy. It carried the compound toward target areas, but could also disperse it too widely, reducing concentration below effective levels. Rain tended to wash the compound out of the air prematurely. Humidity and temperature affected vaporization rates. Operatives had to become amateur meteorologists, understanding how atmospheric conditions would influence chemical weapon deployment. Station 9 developed multiple variants optimized for different conditions. A heavy version using less volatile compounds worked better in windy conditions, persisting longer despite air movement. A light version vaporized almost instantly, creating immediate effects but dissipating quickly, useful for short-duration operations where persistence wasn't needed. A slow-release version used time delay mechanisms to release the compound gradually over several hours, creating sustained effect for extended operations. Testing procedures were extensive and ethically complex. Station 9 couldn't test on actual military working dogs without risking permanent psychological damage to valuable animals. Instead, they worked with civilian dogs, carefully monitoring exposures, ensuring no permanent harm, and compensating owners for their animals' temporary distress. The test results were consistently dramatic. Dogs exposed to even moderate concentrations of weaponized garlic compound became agitated, distressed, and completely unable to perform scent tracking tasks. Some vomited from the olfactory overload. Others displayed obvious discomfort, pawing at their noses, sneezing repeatedly, whining in distress. None showed interest in tracking human scents or performing guard duties. Recovery was gradual but complete. After the compound dispersed or metabolized, dogs' olfactory function returned to normal within hours to days. No permanent damage occurred, though some dogs showed temporary reluctance to perform scent work immediately after exposure, a psychological rather than physiological effect, essentially a learned aversion to situations where they'd experienced olfactory overload. Production scaled up once the formulation was perfected. Chemical synthesis plants across Britain manufactured compound S-44 in quantities measured in hundreds of liters. The compound was packaged in small sealed containers, typically 50 to 100 milliliters each, that could be easily transported and incorporated into S-bomb devices or used directly by operatives in the field. Manufacturing safety protocols were stringent. Workers handling the compound wore respirators and protective clothing, not because of toxicity concerns, but because the smell was so overwhelming that unprotected exposure caused severe nausea and headaches in humans. The manufacturing facilities became locally infamous for the garlic smell that permeated the surrounding area, leading to cover stories about experimental food preservation research. The security classification for garlic bombs was surprisingly high, higher than many explosive devices. The reason was strategic. If the Germans learned about the compound and developed countermeasures, the weapon would become useless. As long as they didn't understand why their dogs suddenly failed, they couldn't effectively respond. Deploying garlic bombs effectively required understanding wind patterns, timing coordination, and dog behavior. The SOE developed detailed protocols for garlic bomb operations, training agents and resistance fighters in the weapon's proper use. Distribution followed established SOE supply networks. Containers of compound S-44 and assembled S-bombs were parachuted to resistance cells across occupied Europe, alongside other sabotage equipment. The containers were marked with distinctive codes, typically yellow bands, warning handlers about the content's smell and requiring careful handling. Training emphasized meteorological awareness. Operatives needed to assess wind direction and speed, determining optimal deployment positions upwind of target areas. Too close, and you risk being detected before the compound took effect. Too far, and the compound wouldn't reach sufficient concentration at the target. The ideal deployment distance was typically 50 to 150 meters upwind, adjusted based on wind strength and terrain features. Timing coordination was critical for complex operations involving multiple infiltration teams. The garlic bombs had to be deployed early enough that dogs would be incapacitated before teams approached, but not so early that handlers might investigate their dog's strange behavior and increase security before the operation commenced. Most operations used a 15-minute window between garlic bomb deployment and infiltration start. Enough time for the compound to take full effect, not so long that handlers had time to respond meaningfully. The operational use in France, described in our opening, represented a textbook garlic bomb deployment. The operative identified prevailing wind direction using simple techniques, watching smoke, feeling breeze on wet finger, then positioned himself upwind of the German command post. He deployed 3 S-bombs at staggered intervals, creating overlapping clouds of compound that ensured complete coverage of the guard dog patrol areas. The dog's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Within minutes of the compound reaching effective concentration, the animals began displaying obvious distress. Their handlers, confused by the sudden behavioral change, attempted to continue patrols, but the dogs refused to cooperate. Some handlers suspected illness, others thought the dogs had somehow been poisoned, but none identified the true cause: olfactory overload from chemical weapon deployment. The commando team, monitoring from a safe distance, waited until the dogs were clearly incapacitated before beginning their approach. They moved through the perimeter that had previously been impenetrable, completed their reconnaissance mission, and withdrew without encountering effective canine security. The intelligence gathered contributed to later Allied operations in the sector. Similar operations occurred across occupied Europe throughout 1943 and 1944. French Maquis resistance fighters used garlic bombs to facilitate sabotage attacks on German fuel depots protected by guard dogs. Belgian resistance deployed them before raids on German administrative buildings. Norwegian resistance used them during operations against German coastal installations where dogs patrolled perimeters looking for infiltrators. The psychological impact on German handlers was significant. When trusted guard dogs suddenly became unreliable, refusing to work, displaying obvious distress, failing to detect intruders they should have caught, handlers lost confidence in their canine security assets. Some suspected the dogs were sick. Others thought they were being deliberately poisoned. A few suspected some form of enemy action but couldn't identify the specific threat. German veterinarians examining affected dogs found nothing physically wrong. The animals recovered fully within hours to days, showing no signs of poisoning, disease, or injury. This baffled veterinary staff and security commanders alike. How could dogs become completely ineffective without any detectable cause? Some German units responded by increasing reliance on human guards, essentially abandoning canine security in areas where dogs had repeatedly failed. This played directly into Allied hands. Human guards were far easier to evade than dogs. Other units rotated dog teams more frequently, reasoning that fresh dogs might perform better than fatigued ones. This approach was logistically burdensome and didn't solve the underlying problem. Captured resistance fighters occasionally revealed garlic bomb operations under interrogation, but German intelligence struggled to develop effective countermeasures. They understood that some chemical compound was being used to disable dogs, but without captured samples or detailed technical information, they couldn't identify the specific compound or develop protection for their animals. German attempts to train dogs to tolerate strong odors failed. You can't train an animal to ignore sensory information that completely overwhelms its most refined sense. It would be like trying to train humans to see normally while staring directly at the sun. The sensory input is simply too intense for the biological system to function despite the overload. Some German units experimented with using multiple dog teams in shifts, reasoning that if one team became affected, a fresh team could take over. This provided some redundancy but was logistically challenging and didn't prevent the compound from affecting all teams if properly deployed. Resistance cells simply waited for shift changes and deployed garlic bombs again, incapacitating the fresh team as easily as the first.
The most desperate German countermeasure involved attempting to desensitize areas around sensitive installations by deliberately exposing them to strong garlic smell, hoping that background garlic odor would mask or dilute the weaponized compound's effect. This failed for two reasons. Natural garlic smell, even in high concentrations, was far weaker than weaponized compound. And sustained exposure to garlic odor in the environment made guard dogs even more sensitive to unusual scents rather than less. British intelligence tracked garlic bomb effectiveness through resistance reports and signals intercepts. The weapon's success rate, operations where dogs failed to detect infiltration after garlic bomb deployment, exceeded 85%, making it one of the most reliable countermeasures against canine security available to Allied forces. The non-lethal nature of garlic bombs created interesting operational dynamics. Unlike killing guard dogs, which would immediately alert handlers to enemy action, temporarily incapacitating them created confusion and uncertainty. Handlers didn't know whether their dogs were sick, frightened, or deliberately targeted. This uncertainty delayed German response and created opportunities for repeated operations using the same technique. Some resistance fighters reported feeling conflicted about using garlic bombs. Many Europeans had strong cultural attachments to dogs and felt uncomfortable distressing animals even for legitimate military purposes. SOE training emphasized that the compound caused no permanent harm and that the alternative, killing guard dogs with poison or weapons, was far more cruel. This framing helped overcome ethical reluctance among operatives who might otherwise have refused to use the weapon. Despite high success rates, garlic bombs had significant limitations that prevented them from being universal solutions to guard dog threats. Understanding these limitations is crucial for appreciating the weapon's actual rather than mythologized capabilities. The most obvious limitation was weather dependency. Garlic bombs required favorable wind conditions to work effectively. No wind meant the compound wouldn't carry to target areas. Too much wind dispersed it below effective concentration. Rain washed it out prematurely. Fog and heavy humidity affected vaporization.
Operations requiring garlic bomb use had to be planned around meteorological conditions, introducing scheduling constraints that sometimes conflicted with operational requirements. Terrain features complicated deployment. Buildings, walls, dense vegetation, and terrain elevation changes all affected airflow patterns, creating unpredictable dispersal. Operatives deploying garlic bombs in complex terrain couldn't reliably predict where the compound would travel, sometimes resulting in inadequate coverage of target areas or accidental exposure of friendly forces. The concentration gradient created zones of variable effectiveness. Areas closest to deployment points received compound concentrations that incapacitated dogs completely. Areas at the edge of the dispersal zone received lower concentrations that merely made dogs uncomfortable without fully disabling them. Handlers positioned at these intermediate zones sometimes noticed their dog's distress early enough to take protective action, moving them upwind, sheltering them indoors before full incapacitation occurred. Dog variation affected outcomes. While most dogs responded predictably to the compound, individual variation meant some animals were more resistant than others. Older dogs with naturally degraded olfactory function sometimes continued working despite compound exposure. Dogs with respiratory issues that partially blocked nasal passages were less affected. A small percentage of dogs seemed naturally more tolerant of olfactory overload, continuing to function despite obvious discomfort. Training differences mattered significantly. Military working dogs received extensive training to perform duties despite distraction and discomfort. The most elite German guard dogs, despite olfactory overload from garlic compound, sometimes continued attempting to perform their duties through sheer training discipline. They were clearly distressed and operating at reduced capability, but not completely incapacitated like less trained animals. Human exposure created operational complications. While the compound was non-toxic, the smell at concentrations needed to affect dogs was nauseating to humans. Operatives deploying garlic bombs sometimes experienced severe headaches, nausea, and temporary loss of appetite from exposure. Resistance fighters working downwind of deployment sites occasionally became sick from the smell, degrading their operational effectiveness. Several documented failures occurred when garlic bomb operations encountered unexpected conditions. One French resistance operation in 1944 deployed garlic bombs to disable dogs guarding an ammunitions depot, but sudden wind shift carried the compound away from the target area and instead affected dogs at a nearby German military kennel. The unintended exposure alerted German security to unusual chemical activity in the area, leading to increased patrols that forced mission cancellation. Another operation failed when operatives underestimated the quantity of compound needed for the target area. They deployed 2 S-bombs when 4 were required, creating insufficient concentration to fully incapacitate the guard dogs. The dogs continued functioning despite obvious discomfort, detected the infiltration team, and raised alarms that resulted in 2 resistance members being captured. German adaptation, while imperfect, did reduce garlic bomb effectiveness over time. By late 1944, German security forces in areas with repeated mysterious guard dog failures began implementing protocols specifically designed to counter unknown chemical threats. These included positioning backup dog teams upwind of primary teams, rotating dogs through sheltered indoor positions, and maintaining reserve human guards ready to respond if dogs became ineffective. The ethical considerations surrounding garlic bombs were complex and remain debated. The weapon deliberately caused distress to animals that had no agency in the conflict. They were tools used by German forces, not willing participants in Nazi war efforts. While the compound caused no permanent physical harm, the psychological impact on some dogs was lasting. Animals that experienced severe olfactory overload during garlic bomb operations sometimes developed ongoing anxiety around strong smells, essentially PTSD-equivalent conditions in canine psychology. SOE leadership defended garlic bombs as humane alternatives to killing guard dogs. The alternative options, poisoning, shooting, or accepting that installations protected by dogs were effectively off-limits, were all worse from animal welfare perspectives. Temporary distress without permanent harm was the most ethical solution available for addressing a real operational problem. Some veterinarians and animal welfare advocates who learned about garlic bombs after the war condemned them as unnecessarily cruel, arguing that the ends didn't justify means that deliberately caused animal suffering. Others, particularly those familiar with World War II operational realities, accepted them as reasonable compromises in circumstances where perfect ethical solutions didn't exist. The psychological impact on German handlers created another ethical dimension. Many handlers developed deep bonds with their dogs, relationships based on trust and partnership. When those dogs suddenly failed, became distressed, refused to work, showed obvious discomfort, handlers felt they'd failed to protect their animals. Some handlers experienced guilt and trauma from being unable to prevent or understand their dog's suffering. Whether this emotional harm to human adversaries was a legitimate war aim or collateral damage remains ethically ambiguous. Post-war documentation revealed that some German dogs affected by garlic bombs never fully recovered their confidence in their handlers or their work. These animals, psychologically damaged by experiences they couldn't understand, were often retired from service and adopted as pets. Their ongoing anxiety around strong smells, flinching at cooking odors, refusing to enter rooms with air fresheners, represented lasting effects of chemical weapon exposure, even though the physical effects were temporary. After 1945, garlic bomb technology didn't disappear. It evolved and influenced both military and civilian applications of chemical deterrence against animals. The principle Station 9 developed remained relevant across subsequent decades of security technology. The basic concept, using chemical compounds to temporarily disable animal senses without causing permanent harm, became foundational to modern animal control and deterrent technologies. Law enforcement agencies worldwide use chemical sprays based on similar principles. Capsaicin sprays against aggressive dogs, chemical deterrents against wildlife, non-lethal animal control agents for various security applications. Military forces continued developing anti-dog chemical compounds during the Cold War. American forces in Vietnam faced similar guard dog challenges. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army units used dogs for perimeter security and tunnel patrol. Special forces developed updated versions of World War II garlic compounds, incorporating modern chemistry knowledge to create more effective, longer-lasting formulations. The specific chemistry evolved significantly. While World War II garlic bombs relied primarily on allicin and simple sulfur compounds, modern formulations use synthetic molecules designed specifically to target canine olfactory receptors. These compounds are more selective, affecting dogs while producing minimal smell detectable by humans, and more potent, requiring smaller quantities to achieve equivalent effects. Soviet and later Russian military forces developed parallel technologies, sometimes based on captured German documentation about British garlic bombs, other times through independent research. Russian military chemical troops included anti-dog compounds in their arsenal of non-lethal agents, though specific details remain classified. Counterterrorism and law enforcement agencies studied garlic bomb concepts for potential applications against drug-sniffing dogs, reasoning that criminals might use similar techniques to evade canine detection. This led to research on protecting working dogs from chemical attacks, training them to recognize early warning signs of olfactory overload and retreat to safety, developing protective equipment that might filter harmful compounds, creating detection systems that would identify chemical threats before dogs were exposed. Commercial security companies developed animal deterrent products based on garlic bomb principles. These are marketed for protecting property from wildlife intrusion, deterring aggressive dogs, or preventing animals from approaching sensitive areas. The concentrations are far lower than military-grade compounds, sufficient to discourage animals without causing the severe distress that World War II weapons produced, but the underlying mechanism remains identical. Agricultural applications emerged unexpectedly. Farmers dealing with predators threatening livestock experimented with garlic-based chemical deterrents to protect animals without killing predators. These applications balance agricultural necessity with wildlife conservation, using temporary olfactory deterrents rather than lethal methods to manage human-wildlife conflict. Veterinary research stimulated by World War II garlic bomb development contributed to broader understanding of canine olfactory biology. Scientists studying how dogs' noses could be temporarily overloaded without permanent damage advanced knowledge of mammalian olfactory systems generally. This research had implications for human olfactory disorders, understanding sensory processing, and developing treatments for smell-related medical conditions. Ethical frameworks developed post-war to address chemical weapons specifically excluded compounds like garlic bombs from most restrictions. International chemical weapons conventions focus on lethal agents, those causing death or permanent injury. Non-lethal compounds causing only temporary sensory disruption fall into ambiguous legal territory, neither explicitly prohibited nor explicitly permitted under most international law. The historical documentation of garlic bomb operations remained heavily classified until the 1990s, when British government began selective declassification of World War II intelligence materials. Even today, some aspects remain redacted. Specific chemical formulations, detailed synthesis procedures, operational locations of certain missions. The concern is that complete disclosure might enable hostile actors to replicate the weapons. Museums rarely display information about garlic bombs, primarily because the weapons leave no physical artifacts suitable for exhibition. Unlike weapons with mechanical components that can be safely displayed, garlic bombs were consumable chemical devices that don't survive use. The few surviving examples in government and military museums are sealed containers with warning labels, uninspiring to visitors who can't appreciate their significance without detailed explanation. Academic studies of unconventional warfare consistently cite garlic bombs as examples of effective niche weapons, tools designed for specific tactical problems rather than general application. Military strategists studying asymmetric warfare use garlic bombs to illustrate how technologically inferior forces can develop targeted countermeasures against specific enemy capabilities. Veterans of SOE operations who used garlic bombs rarely discuss them publicly, even after declassification. The weapons lack the drama of explosives or the obvious danger of firearms, making them seem trivial despite their operational significance. Additionally, some veterans felt uncomfortable discussing weapons that deliberately caused animal distress, preferring to focus on operations against human military targets. The cultural impact of garlic bombs was surprisingly limited given their innovative nature. Unlike umbrella weapons or sleeve guns, which captured public imagination through spy fiction and film, garlic bombs never achieved widespread recognition. This is partly because their function, making dogs temporarily ineffective, seems less traumatic than assassination weapons or explosive devices. Contemporary security professionals studying historical unconventional weapons often overlook garlic bombs, focusing instead on more obviously lethal technologies. This represents a gap in security education because the principles underlying garlic bombs, exploiting sensory biology, targeting non-human security assets, using chemicals to create temporary rather than permanent effects, remain relevant to modern security threats. Behind the technical details and strategic analysis were living beings, both human and canine, whose lives were affected by garlic bomb deployments. Understanding their experiences provides important perspective on this unusual weapon. German dog handlers developed profound bonds with their animals, relationships based on mutual trust and years of training. When those dogs suddenly became distressed and ineffective, handlers felt they'd failed their partners. One German veteran, interviewed decades after the war, described his dog's reaction to what was likely a garlic bomb exposure. He was the most reliable animal I'd ever worked with. Then, one night, he just broke, whining, pawing at his nose, refusing to work. I thought I'd done something wrong, failed to notice he was sick. The dogs themselves experienced something terrifying, sudden, overwhelming sensory input they couldn't escape or understand. Imagine if your vision suddenly became 1,000 times brighter, every surface glowing intensely, all detail lost in overwhelming luminosity. That's analogous to what garlic compound exposure did to dogs' olfactory senses. They couldn't retreat from the sensation because it was in the air they breathed. They couldn't communicate their distress to handlers in ways humans would understand. They just suffered through it until the compound dispersed or metabolized. SOE operatives deploying garlic bombs described mixed feelings about the weapon. One agent's memoir, published in the 1980s, included this reflection. I had no moral conflict about killing German soldiers. They were armed enemies in a war. But making their dogs suffer bothered me more than I'd expected. The dogs hadn't chosen to be part of the war. They were just doing what they'd been trained to do, trusting their handlers. Resistance fighters who witnessed garlic bomb effects on German guard dogs sometimes expressed satisfaction that bordered on vindictive. These were animals that had helped capture and potentially killed resistance members. Other resistance fighters felt uncomfortable about the necessity of causing animal suffering, viewing it as regrettable but unavoidable collateral damage in a just war. The recovery process for exposed dogs varied. Most animals physically recovered within hours to days, their olfactory function returning to normal as the compound cleared their systems. But behavioral changes sometimes persisted. Exposed dogs showing increased anxiety around strong smells, reluctance to work in areas where they'd previously been exposed, or generalized nervousness that suggested psychological trauma. German veterinarians treating affected dogs faced diagnostic challenges. The animals showed obvious distress but no physical symptoms that veterinary medicine of the 1940s could identify as causative. Blood tests revealed nothing abnormal. Physical examinations found no injuries, infections. The dogs just didn't want to work, showed heightened anxiety, and couldn't perform scent-based tasks effectively. Without understanding the chemical warfare aspect, veterinarians sometimes attributed the symptoms to psychological breakdowns or mysterious illnesses. The relationship between handlers and dogs sometimes never fully recovered after garlic bomb exposure. Handlers who witnessed their dog's distress but couldn't help them lost confidence in their ability to protect their animals. Dogs that associated their handlers with situations where they experienced olfactory overload sometimes developed reduced trust or responsiveness. The chemical weapon disrupted not just canine olfactory function, but the human-animal partnership that made military working dogs effective. Post-war reunions between handlers and dogs, in cases where both survived and handlers kept their dogs after demobilization, revealed lasting effects. Some dogs maintained nervous behaviors around strong smells, decades after exposure. Handlers often attributed these behaviors to general war trauma, not understanding the specific chemical warfare origin. The garlic bomb's legacy lived on in the anxiety responses of animals that had experienced something their biology couldn't process or their minds couldn't forget. The garlic bomb never achieved fame. It didn't destroy tanks or sink ships. It didn't kill enemy soldiers or obliterate infrastructure. By conventional military metrics, it was almost laughably trivial, a weapon whose entire purpose was making dogs temporarily unable to smell properly. But measuring significance by destructive power misses the garlic bomb's true importance. This weapon represented something profound about warfare, that security systems have vulnerabilities, that biological dependencies can be exploited, and that sometimes the most effective weapons target not the enemy directly, but the capabilities the enemy relies upon. Station 9's chemists created a solution to a specific tactical problem, German guard dogs that made infiltration operations nearly impossible. They solved it through chemistry and biology rather than brute force, temporarily disabling a security asset without killing animals or alerting handlers to the specific threat method. The garlic bomb turned man's best friend into man's most unreliable security system. It exploited the very trait that made dogs effective guards, their incredibly sensitive noses, by overwhelming that sense to the point of uselessness. The dogs weren't killed or injured. They were just rendered temporarily ineffective, unable to perform the duties they'd been trained for, betraying their handlers through no fault of their own. The psychological impact rippled through German security organizations. When trusted guard dogs failed repeatedly and mysteriously, handlers lost confidence in canine security. This forced reallocation of resources to human guards who were far easier to evade, creating vulnerabilities that Allied forces exploited throughout occupied Europe. For the dogs themselves, garlic bombs represented a cruel if temporary ordeal. Sensory overload they couldn't escape, distress they couldn't communicate, suffering they couldn't understand. The compound caused no permanent physical damage, but for animals living in the moment, unable to comprehend that the torture would end, the experience was genuinely traumatic. The ethical questions surrounding garlic bombs remain unresolved. Was deliberately causing animal distress justified by military necessity? Were garlic bombs more humane than alternatives like poisoning or shooting guard dogs? Does the temporary nature of the effect excuse the suffering caused? These questions don't have simple answers. They require weighing competing values in contexts where perfect ethical solutions don't exist. The garlic bomb's legacy persists in modern non-lethal animal control technologies, in security planning that accounts for biological vulnerabilities, in understanding that the most effective countermeasures sometimes target not the threat directly, but the capabilities that make threats effective. So why did this disturbing British garlic bomb make German dogs betray their masters? Because it didn't make dogs betray anything. It simply overwhelmed their senses so completely that they couldn't perform their trained duties. The betrayal was biological necessity, not choice or disloyalty. The dogs remained loyal. They wanted to protect their handlers, to patrol their assigned areas, to detect intruders as they'd been trained. But their noses, the tools they needed to do those jobs, had been sabotaged by chemistry. They became unreliable not through lack of discipline or courage, but because British scientists had found a vulnerability in canine biology and weaponized it. That's the garlic bomb's lesson. Loyalty, training, and dedication matter, but they can't overcome biological limitations. Overwhelm the senses, and the most loyal animal becomes ineffective. Exploit the vulnerability, and the strongest security becomes the weakest link. The Germans had technology, training, and tactical doctrine. The British had chemistry and creativity. And in this particular battle, the fight to neutralize guard dog security, chemistry won. Sometimes the most disturbing weapons aren't the ones that kill. Sometimes they're the ones that betray. From garlic bombs that confused guard dogs, to umbrellas that killed silently, to tire bursters that stopped armies, World War II weapons reveals the strangest, most ingenious, and most effective weapons ever created. Subscribe now for more incredible stories of innovation that changed history in the most unexpected ways.